Good morning, everybody. I am John O'Loughlin. Welcome to my channel. It is called McDuff Lives. And this morning, I'm so excited to have Harley Schlanger back for another hour or so of very stimulating conversation. It's always exciting to me to hear what's on Harley's mind. I've been keeping up with his writings at the Larouche Organization, and he has a new article out about the situation in Texas and how that and the Great Reset and the plans of the bankers' dictatorship, as he calls it, are unfolding.
Yeah.
And oops, we'll have to hang on for a second while Harley deals with a little personal matter. But what I was saying about the bankers' dictatorship is what I think Harley's a shorthand of what we're looking at in the future if we don't stop it, and that is the control of our government as well as our financial system, all out of the hands of the big banks. So with that introduction, Harley, welcome, and thanks for joining us once again here at McDuff Lives.
Well, good to see you again, John. And you're absolutely right about what we're facing. The so-called Great Reset or Great Transformation, whatever they want to call it, certainly not great. But what it represents is an attempt to do something that they've been trying to do for years, which is to put every single government on the planet under subordination to a global central bank, which is the central bank of central banks. And this is what was laid out over a year and a half ago at Jackson Hole, Wyoming, by Larry Fink of BlackRock and by Mark Carney from the Bank of England. And what they basically are saying is that their greatest fear is that constituencies will put pressure on elected representatives to defend the interests of the people, which is, of course, what they're supposed to do. That's what our system's supposed to be about. But they say that could be disruptive of a smooth running financial system. Well, what we have is not a smooth running financial system. We have a looting system run by what Perkins called economic hitmen, who are not interested in the general welfare. They're interested in private profit. And what they're saying is that we cannot allow, this is the Davos crew, the World Economic Forum. Klaus Schwab wrote this in his book. We cannot allow sovereign nations to get in the way of the interests of an international banking system. Therefore, we have to move power, not just monetary power and credit policy, but spending policy into the hands of the central banks who act on behalf of the private banks and financial institutions and give the policy-making direction to technocrats. Now, that goes against our Constitution. It goes against any sovereign nation state. And they're trying to impose this now with Biden, with the European Union, with the Boris Johnson government. And we saw at the recent Davos conference that there are some countries that aren't going to go along with that. I should add, by the way, that as you know from our report, the Great Reset, a big part of it is to impose the Green New Deal. And what I just wrote about is the wonderful qualities of the Green New Deal and the neoliberal system when it came to a polar vortex slamming Texas. We saw what happened. And that's a warning for what could happen to the European power grid, to the grid in a number of other states in the United States, and why we cannot rely on unreliable sources of less energy dense electrical production. So it's a big picture, but I think the most important thing is that the government that's in office right now with Biden has less conflict against this than the Trump administration did. With Trump, at least, we knew there were some people who believed that national sovereignty meant that the government should be making decisions of this sort, not private conglomerates. With Biden, we have the private conglomerates pretty much in control, although that could change. We'll have to see, but that's where the battlefront is right now.
Well, that was an interesting comment at the end. I don't see any hope for stopping the private interests controlling the government. Well, could you give me an idea of what you're thinking there?
Well, 75 million people voted for Donald Trump because they had some connection to the belief of national sovereignty. Many of them may not know what that means, but they don't want private technocrats working for bankers and the shadow financial system making decisions about their future, because those decisions have been terrible. Now, the problem is there's no leadership. I think Donald Trump, despite whatever intentions he might have, is going to be in court most of the next 4 years, if not in jail. I mean, they obviously intend to destroy him completely, and they have an intention to go after the movement. Now, as far as I can see, there's no leadership in the movement. And so what we at the Larouche Organization are doing is trying to, first of all, give people the bigger picture. Because, you know, John, the main thing that the oligarchy has going for it is that most people don't understand what's being done. They don't know who's doing it, and they don't understand what the options are, other than, you know, a vague "Make America Great," national sovereignty, certain kinds of slogans. And what we've got to do, and that's what we're doing with our new report, you know, The Great Leap Backward, LaRouche Exposes the Green New Deal, is giving people a picture of the terrain. Who's the enemy? What's their intention? And who are the potential allies who are going to pose this? The reason I say that it's not a done deal is that we can see, even with this current slant in government toward the Democrats, with the president a Democrat, with the Senate controlled by the Democrats, the House controlled by the Democrats, it's not a huge majority. And there will be splits in the Democratic Party, especially if the so-called progressive wing ever realizes that Biden is not going to go along with what they want. You know, the Neera Tanden nomination is a perfect example of that. You know, this is someone who makes Hillary Clinton look mildly sympathetic. So you try to put people like that in. Janet Yellen, a total supporter of this quantitative easing globalist banking operation. Blinken at State, a total supporter of the war policy. At some point, the grouping around people like Glenn Greenwald and Jimmy Dore, there are a number of progressive speakers out there who don't like this. Now, can we possibly get an alliance between what in 2010 would have been the Tea Party and the Occupy Wall Street? That would have been something that could have worked. Don't agree on everything, but at least we don't really like these financial swindlers who control both parties making the policies. Now then, globally, it's more clear. Russia's not going to go along with the Great Reset. China's not going to go along with it. So the potential exists to resist this internationally. And where I am in Germany, we're seeing real fractures occurring in the ruling party, the Christian Democrats. They just nominated someone who's anti-green to be the replacement for Merkel. Now, that's not definite yet, but the Social Democrats have collapsed. The Green Party has become a war party in Germany. So you look at France, Macron is only staying in power because the opposition is so weak. Italy, the government changes every couple of months. I don't think they have the power to ram this through. So that's why I say we've got to figure out what are the weak points in the party system, and can we get at least a sizable minority of people to look at what the alternatives are.
Well, here at McDuff Lives, Harley, we are completely 100% behind you in this effort, and I think your leadership is crucial. I have been studying the book pamphlet called The Great Leap Backward. Myself, I have a copy of it, and I've featured it on my show a couple of days ago. And I'm telling you, folks, get a copy of this little book. It's $20. You get it from Larouche Organization. But what you get in there is the arguments you need when you talk to your friends. When you're trying to persuade other people, you need to have authoritative facts to talk that are your basis. Because when it comes right down to it, the only thing that really matters is facts, is the truth. What is the truth? And I highly recommend this book. I'm going to have Paul Gallagher on the show on Friday, March the 5th, to go through his part of that book. And I'm hoping to line up 3 or 4 of the other great authors that are contributed to it. So absolutely 100% behind you, Harley, on your effort to, and the direction you want to take it. That is, my big problem is, how many times can we demonstrate that the party system is failing the middle class? The
Well,
party
John,
system is
you
failing
mentioned
all of
something
us.
earlier. Paul just wrote an article today on this question of the pending danger of either a deflationary collapse or a hyperinflationary explosion. And he went through some of the figures, and these are quite striking. The growth of debt in the world economy, the growth of debt. I think I have these figures here, if you give me a second. Yeah, the global debt was up 7.5% in 2020. The total US debt is up 11% in 2020. The federal balance sheet is now at 7.6 trillion, which means they're buying treasuries, mortgage-backed securities, and some corporate junk bonds. Now, if you keep doing this, you're going to either have actually, here's the other figure that's really amazing is US money supply is up 26% since February 2020. So in 1 year, 26%. What happens to all that money? Some of it, they say, went into people's savings. Some of it a lot of it went into the stock market. What happens if the stock bubble pops? You're going to have a chain reaction series of bankruptcies. So we're in an unsustainable situation. And when people look at this, then you begin to get the answer to why they're trying to reorganize the whole financial system and push things into a Green New Deal. They're looking for a new bubble. And in our report, we have a number of very fascinating articles. One of the ones I liked the most was my friend Rich Freeman wrote an article on the role of Prince Charles and the British royal family in this. I don't know if you had a chance to read that one yet.
Oh, that's a verboten topic here at McDuff. We got our whole channel struck down just because I talked a little bit about the famous princes of Buckingham Palace. So, but anyway, I'm
just to get the report and read it themselves. But it is, look, it's absolutely uncontestable that Prince Philip and Prince Charles have devoted much of their lifetime of activity to promoting population reduction. You can quote them on that. I mean, if you get struck for quoting someone, what chance is there to get the truth out? But what we've done with this is shown who really runs the World Economic Forum, who's behind it, what interests are involved. Why are there people who are so dedicated to the idea of shutting down coal and nuclear plants to replace them with inefficient, unreliable systems? Now, if the social media were going to be fair in their censorship, they would shut down all the environmentalists who say that the wind turbines freezing had nothing to do with the great deep freeze in Texas, because it's unmistakably the case that about 20% of the electric grid, which is related to wind power, was shut down by the cold. Now, that doesn't mean that's the whole story. And if you had a chance to read my article, I brought up the other question, which is deregulation. How many people remember what Enron was doing in the 1990s and the first year of the 21st century? Enron was looting California the same way the Texas companies are looting Texas right now by charging ridiculous rates because they couldn't deliver the power. And Enron had a deregulation plan that nearly brought California to its knees. And then after Enron itself collapsed because of stock swindles and various kinds of manipulations, in Texas, they went ahead with the Enron model. And that had a lot to do with the deregulation, which led to the problem this last week. So, this is where we begin to see the problem why the censorship is going on, because the truth is damaging to the people who are trying to push these policies.
Yeah, and I remember how shocked I was. I was doing a show, Harley, on the opening ceremony to the 2012 London Olympics, and within that ceremony, they had this incredible pageantry, including what looked like hundreds, if not thousands, of hospital beds with children in them that were sick and were dying, and they had these creatures that would come around that were clothed in black and had beady green eyes, and it was like they're showing us, they're telling us that if we don't comply, you know, and I'm like, you know, freaking out, and then boom, they just shut the whole thing down. Just shut. I've gotten censored before, but right in the middle of a show, that tells me, that tells you who rules. You know, if the people you're not allowed to talk about, those are the ones that rule. And I will never give up telling the stories that I can learn about this. And on my new channel, as soon as I can, I'm going to be republishing that event to show what happened. Oh no, Andy's going to get us cut down again. Don't show it, Andy. No, but you see the hospital beds there in the middle, and but no, Andy, don't. Good God, Andy's a nut. Andy, I got to get you under control, buddy. Hey, can I change the subject back to a little bit back to Germany and Europe, because I've started a new series with the journalist Garland Nixon of Washington, D.C. area. He's a veteran journalist who's been with Fox News in the past, but he's gone very independent right now, starting his own YouTube channel. And so he's been my guest, and will be Monday nights at 8 p.m. Eastern Standard Time for the foreseeable future. He's an exciting thinker, and we ended up talking last night about Nord Stream 2, the pipeline that is proposed or was proposed, and
90% completed.
And okay, so I'm just going to start there and say his theory is that this is geopolitics, with the Americans opposing the deal between Germany and Russia for obvious reasons, that then they won't need our American oil. Can you talk about how you feel about what's going on with that Nord Stream 2, and it's something that a lot of folks here don't know much about? So, but I think it's probably is very important, and I'd be interested in your perspective on what's going on, and politically, has it made a difference that Biden is in office now as regards to this particular project?
No, because this is really the workings of what you would call the deep state, the permanent bureaucracy in the State Department and in the intelligence community. The whole idea, look, if you look at that map, you see how close Russia is to Germany, as opposed to how far away the United States is. And the idea that we would provide liquid natural gas or other kinds of fuels to Germany as opposed to Russia, it doesn't make a lot of sense. And the agreement was not just Russia and Germany, but there are 11 other countries in Europe that are part of this. And this is part of an idea of an integration of Europe with Russia. And this goes back to Charles de Gaulle. Speaking of the time of the Kennedy administration, de Gaulle had a certain view of how Europe should go. And his view was that you have to have an alliance between Russia, Germany, and France. Now, this, of course, is what got Germany in trouble in the 19th century, because the idea of the Trans-Siberian Railroad, a railroad going from Paris to Vladivostok, was considered an act of war by the admirals of the British Navy. And so geopolitics began as a strategy for making sure that the Eurasian heartland was never unified with Western Europe. And the Eurasian heartland, of course, is Eastern Europe, European Russia, and then, of course, the whole of Asia on through China, Japan, and so on. So the British intent has always been to keep a separation between Germany and Russia primarily, and secondly, to bring the United States into alliance with the British Empire. And, when NATO was created after World War II, the idea was to keep the United States in Europe, the Russians out of Europe, and Germany divided. So after 1989 and the fall of the East German Republic and the agreement made between the Bush administration and others, including Thatcher and Mitterrand, they went to Helmut Kohl, the German chancellor, and said, we'll only allow unification if you sign on to the European Union and allow Germany's economic strength not to be used to build up Eastern Europe, but to fund a common currency for Western Europe. This was called the transfer union, and the Germans didn't like that, but they didn't have the power to go against, especially Thatcher and Mitterrand were the two leaders in this. I've had a chance to talk to some of the people who worked for Helmut Kohl, who were at the meeting when James Baker promised the Germans that they would be allowed to unify if they signed on for the EU. But don't worry, NATO would not be moving eastward.
Mm-hmm.
Well, what have we seen since 1990? NATO moving eastward, and possibly including into Ukraine, into Georgia, into Belarus. So when you look at something like the Nord Stream 2, it's part of a different geographical alliance than what's allowed under British geopolitics, because it would connect the benefit, or would be a benefit for the Western European countries to have closer relationship with Russia. And this was something that the Germans wanted. It's something that the Danes wanted. As I said, there were 11 countries involved in this. The former head of Total in France was a big supporter of this because it would make Germany less dependent on oil from North Africa and from the French. Now, what happens? You had the Trump administration come in saying they want to ally with Russia. They want cooperative relationships with Putin.
Mm-hmm.
Primarily to deal with the Middle East, with the insurgency of terrorists in Syria, Afghanistan, Iraq, the whole crescent there. But what happened? It worked. The Russians went in with the tacit approval of Trump. There was US and Russian military cooperation, and ISIS and Al-Qaeda was crushed, or almost crushed. Part of the reason for that is that the Trump administration was not continuing the Obama policy of building up the terrorist forces as so-called moderate rebels. Now, once Russia established that, showed the strength they had militarily and their willingness to consolidate the existing governments in the Middle East, this led to a panic. And you had a little bit before that, you had the Ukraine coup in 2014. But then all of a sudden, Pompeo and others took the lead from the Atlantic Council and the Henry Jackson Society, two British think tanks. Now, the Atlantic Council is not technically British, but essentially it is. It works directly with NATO and so on. And what they argued is that you're going to force Germany to be dependent on Russian oil and gas, and Putin will exact a price for that, a political price. Well, what's Putin going to do? Tell the Germans to pull out of NATO? That's not going to happen. There's no downside for Germany from an alliance with Russia. In fact, most of the German Mittelstand, which is the small and medium enterprises, the machine tool shops, the energy producers, the train and airplane companies, they wish to have more relationship with Russia because Russia would be a good partner for them now. But the sanction regime that was started after the Crimea vote and after the Ukraine situation was designed to put a wedge between Russia and Germany in particular. And now we're seeing the latest excuse is the Navalny affair. Now, the Russians are saying, show us the evidence that it was Novichok. We sent Navalny to Germany for treatment. If the Russians really wanted him killed, why would they send him to a German hospital? So where's the evidence that the supposedly deadly chemical weapon was used against him? And of course, they've never provided it. Instead, they say that the West is going to support Navalny. Putin raised the question, why is it that social media is shut down in the United States if there's a protest against government policy, but social media is allowed to continue to operate in Russia if you're attacking the Russians? So another question that comes up in Germany now all the time. If you're really worried about someone being put in prison as a political opposition figure in Russia, what about Julian Assange rotting away in a British prison when he's guilty of no crime? So there are all kinds of hypocrisies involved in this. But John, it really does go back to Halford Mackinder and British geopolitics at the beginning of the 1900s, which is the British desire to keep the European continent divided, weak, or under a supranational regime, as such as the European Union, which can be manipulated through NATO and other means against Russia and China. So that's what the Nord Stream 2 issue is all about. The German population as a whole supports it. Polls here show about 80% support for it. It will cheapen oil and gas. And by the way, it's coming at a time where the environmentalists in all parties in Germany are shutting down coal and nuclear. What's going to happen if they can't get the liquefied natural gas and the pipeline, the Nord Stream 2 pipeline working? They're going to be dependent on potentially fragile supply lines from the Middle East, and then the much less effective supply coming from the United States. And by the way, I think what we saw this last week is we need to keep a lot of our natural gas here in the United States. So it's a classic example of a divide and conquer strategy coming from the City of London and their allies among the geopoliticians and the think tanks in Washington, the Brzezinski, the people mentored by Brzezinski, Madeleine Albright, Susan Rice, who falls into that. You have Tony Blinken, who's part of that school, Biden, Secretary of State. It's just a rampant gang of geopolitical thinkers. And instead of geopolitics, we need to go back to what Franklin Roosevelt talked about, what John Kennedy talked about, which is common interests of mankind. Let's start with our common interests rather than our disagreements. And then we can talk about what we disagree on. And this is what Trump said he was going to do, but he was sidelined by Russiagate and then pretty much dominated by the Pompeo crowd from the State Department.
Well, I think that we've got to the heart of a very big issue, because if the United States can't, or if Britain and the United States acting together can't stop the Nord Stream 2, then the geopolitics of Europe have changed forever, because then they'll be looking to the East for their power, and they won't need to have NATO. And, to me, one of the most welcome things I could think of would be the disintegration of this, Wall Street, City of London military power called NATO.
You're absolutely right. And this is what they fear, because there are other factors here. For example, Germany, Merkel appointed her former defense secretary, Ursula von der Leyen, to be the head of the European Council. Von der Leyen botched the whole purchase of vaccines, so that there's no vaccines available for most of Europe. The Russians are now coming forward and supplying their Sputnik 5 vaccine in Eastern Europe. The Chinese are offering this. On top of that, the German industry is very much interested in working with China on trade, on high-speed rail, working on triangular projects in the Middle East and Africa. And so there's a real impulse in Europe to look east. This is a natural impulse. I mean, this is the whole idea of the Eurasian heartland. But if you look at it from the standpoint of Mackinder, it's competition. It's who's going to control these areas, as opposed to, is there mutual benefit from cooperation? And so you have the attacks on China around the so-called Uyghur question in Xinjiang province. You have the Navalny issue. You have the Ukraine issue. You have the so-called Afghan bounty issue, the invention of the New York Times and some fraudulent intelligence operatives saying that the Russians are offering money to Afghan Taliban to kill American soldiers. That's still being discussed by people like John Kerry and Nancy Pelosi. And I think by Biden also. Biden said we have to investigate this. So this is the world of the Cold War. This is the 1950s, 1960s. This is the world that John Kennedy inherited and tried to make a change. He tried to work out an arrangement to break the mutual and assured destruction military doctrine. And I think he paid for it with his life. And instead, we went another 20 years, almost 20 more years with the Cold War. Then when the Cold War ended, what happened? The triumphalists of the unilateralism of the Project for the New American Century sent London and Wall Street bankers into Russia to loot the place to the bone. And the life expectancy in Russia dropped dramatically under the policies that were imposed by Yeltsin. So Putin came in as part of a nationalist impulse against that. Instead of welcoming that, the idea that a stable Russia as a nuclear power would be better for US-Russian relations, he's been vilified as a small-time KGB thug, a poisoner. If you were to write this as in the 1950s as a science fiction novel, it would not be believable what we're seeing. But that's what so-called realpolitik is today. And who's dictating it? The people who need war and confrontation to protect their holdings in their system. That's the so-called military-industrial complex, which now includes the social media companies.
Yes, indeed. Well, I think they were all started by the military, and it all comes out of DARPA, if I'm not mistaken. So
you're absolutely right. DARPA, and you know who played a big role in this? Our friend George Shultz. Because when he went back after he left the Reagan administration, he went to Stanford, the Hoover Institute, and became a kind of godfather to some of the early startups through his connections with from Bechtel with a lot of the vulture funds or the venture funds as they're called. So he helped steer some of this, and this is partly the role Shultz played in 1999 in vetting George W. Bush and bringing together a cabinet, which included Condoleezza Rice from Stanford and others, that became the basis of the George W. Bush administration, the Wolfowitz crowd, the neocons, and that was when the social media types began moving in. And by the way, we've talked a lot about the Atlantic Council. You know this figure Alperovitz, who's a key figure. He was with CrowdStrike, the company that allegedly claimed that Russia did the meddling in the 2016 election. Alperovitz from CrowdStrike is part of the Atlantic Council. These are people who came through Stanford, University of Chicago, and MIT, all of which are Shultz connections.
Mm-hmm. This business with you probably, I don't know if it hit much in Europe or not, but the quote from Joe Biden recently about how Black and Hispanic people have more trouble understanding computers and the internet. Did that hit your radar screen at all?
No.
No. Okay. I thought it was very telling that this is a guy that's lived in an elite bubble his whole life, and he's still thinking that there's wild people out in the jungle somewhere that don't know how to run computers, and we've got to help these poor people. That white man's burden attitude is been part of Joe Biden his whole life, and he doesn't know any other way to look at the world. And it resonated when you mentioned about going back in time, and that's what we're doing. And where I was thinking this takes us back to Woodrow Wilson,
Oh,
who
yeah.
who basically, he said there is a force behind the curtain that nobody talks about. The highest businessmen in the land will only speak of it beneath their breath. It's a very famous quote of Woodrow Wilson. And then, when he gets into office, he purges all the black people, out of the civil service positions that they had worked their way into. And because it's this innate attitude that they're superior. We the white Anglo-Saxon Protestants of America are somehow superior to people that don't look like us or don't have the same genealogical heritage. And that is something that I would hope, the irony of it, just the sheer irony of it, is going to hit people at some point, that we've got a president now who is basically no different from a Woodrow Wilson in terms of his attitude towards race. And he, is covering up, for all of these horrific policies that do exactly the same thing, and that is to grind down the lifespan, the health of people in the third world. And you think about this, the COVID, and I think, my God, what's going on in Latin America with these? If people in Brazil get it, they can't just go to the store and say, here, give me some HCQ or whatever it is. I think, when we're talking about a depopulation program, to just look inside, the bounds of the United States to see if it's having an effect or not is a mistake, because if their real goal is to decrease the population of the world from 8 billion to 1 billion, or whatever numbers you choose, then this is certainly one way they could do it. And you go ahead.
I became friends a number of years ago with Mervyn Dimely. I don't know if the name rings a bell with you. He was the first Black lieutenant governor in the United States. He was elected in California in 1976 as lieutenant governor. Then he became the head of the Congressional Black Caucus by 1988. And one of the things that he argued is that if you want to understand the problem with Black politicians in the United States, look at their attitudes toward Africa. And he said, we talk about the African American caucus and African American this, African American that. When are we doing anything to help the people of Africa? And he began the process of taking African American elected officials to Africa to actually look at what people wanted, what they needed. And this reminds me, you mentioned Woodrow Wilson, this idea of noblesse oblige. Well, we'll take care of them because we might need them as servants. You know whose attitude that was? Barack Obama. Obama went to Africa, I believe in 2014, and spoke to South African students. And he was asking them, well, you've made so much progress. What are your hopes for the future? And people said, a nice house, a car. And he just said, whoa, 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 whoa. If all of you got an American style standard of living, the planet would boil over.
Oh my God.
Now, what is he saying to them? He's saying, we'll use you when we want to bring up racism and wave the banner of racism. But essentially, he had the same attitude toward young Africans that the British colonial and the Belgian and the Dutch colonial masters had, which is, you better know your place. And when he left the room exploded in rage, which of course was never shown on American television. But that shows something about the attitude, the real racism. People worry about the Klan, the American Nazis, this and that. Most of them are too incompetent to organize a 2-car funeral procession. The real threat comes from this higher level eugenics outlook.
Exactly.
The outlook of the Rockefellers, the Morgans, the Thomas Lamonts, the Harrimans, the Bushes, which essentially is this idea that there are certain people who are genetically better, And the ones who lack the genetic qualities, well, we'll help them out a little bit, but essentially they do not really have the same right to life that we do. And you know, it's ironic if you actually study what was going on in the late 20s. The eugenics movement was behind the immigration policy in the United States to limit the number of immigrants. And when Hitler sent Ernst Rudin, who became later the Nazi minister of race, in 1932, Rudin was sent to get an award in New York City, presided over by Averell Harriman. And Rudin said at this banquet, "I wish we had the same enlightened views on race in Germany that you have in the United States." And so it was the Harriman crowd, which included Prescott Bush, which included the Morgans and the Rockefellers and others, who had this attitude that there are useless eaters that maybe we'll keep alive, but we owe them nothing. And this is the outlook that became embedded in the environmentalist movement with people like Alexander King, the Club of Rome. And as long as we're mentioning it, let's bring up Henry Kissinger, who in 1974 pulled together a committee under the National Security Council that drafted a memo called National Security Study Memo 200, which was an argument for population control in the developing sector. And what it said, this is classic British geopolitics, it said that countries like Egypt, India, Nigeria, I think Pakistan, he identified 13 countries, all of which are majority non-white. He said they're going to be competing for scarce resources with us. And it's in our interest to make sure they reduce their population growth so as to protect the availability of those resources for basically the Western countries. This was then in November 1975. This became official US policy, and this document was classified for 20 years. Now, we got a hold of a copy. It was leaked. And when we started reporting it, people said, "Oh, that couldn't possibly be true." But if I see it's up on the screen now, people should take a look at this to get a sense of what real racism is. These people are not entitled to use the own natural resources in their countries. This is the anti-sovereign view of this global establishment, which is now targeting countries in the West, not just the poorer countries, but it's targeting the so-called advanced sector. And the whole Green New Deal is going to loot the populations of the United States and Western Europe.
That is profoundly resonant with me because I've been studying that myself in my book reading. So the first one that really clued me into the connection between the eugenics movement and the immigration restrictions is a fairly new book by Daniel Okrent called The Guarded Gate. And I've read that on my show, and I recommend that to everyone. And from there, William Engdahl has done some fantastic work in exposing the NSSM 200 and Kissinger's role in that. But I would go back and make another connection, and that is to George F. Kennan, who's quoted in the preface of Engdahl's book, The Seeds of Destruction. And what he says is basically what NSSM 200 says. And he said, we are going to have to recognize that we have 6% of the world's consumption, but we have 50% of the world's consumption, but only 6% of the population. And this is a strategic imbalance that we're going to have to maintain. And if we can't maintain it, we'll lose. So what we need to do is we need to turn to the population control of the third world. And as we do it, and it resonates with me, we can't be chivalrous. We can't have empathy. We can't be the people that we were told that we should be when our when our parents told us, how to be good people. We can't be those good Americans anymore. We have to be, in other words, practically the same as Nazis going into Germany, going into Poland and Russia with the same attitude of.
Right. And John, one of the dividing points in the U.S. was the Franklin Roosevelt opposition to Churchill during the war about the post-war order.
Mm-hmm.
Roosevelt had the anti-imperial outlook of the founding fathers. And there are a number of discussions. There's a book, I don't know if you've ever seen this, Elliot Roosevelt, Franklin's son, wrote a book called As I Saw It, where he talks about the evening meetings over dinner between Churchill and his father. And the biggest bone of contention was what would happen after the war. And Churchill kept insisting that the imperial order has to be protected. And Roosevelt at one point said, Winston, Americans are not dying in this war to preserve the British imperial system. And Roosevelt describes that Churchill nearly choked and turned purple in rage. And if you look at it, the death of Franklin Roosevelt brought in a very little man, Harry Truman, who fell very quickly under Churchill's control. And the US in Vietnam, for example, was there to try to protect the imperial system. In Africa, the colonial system was supported to a large extent by American corporations that were working with the Dutch, the British, the Belgians, and others. And one of the people who tried to change that was John Kennedy. There are fascinating copies of speeches that Kennedy gave from the floor of the Senate in 58 and 59, where he was outspoken in his opposition to continued imperial control in Africa. And this was the FDR tradition through Kennedy. And this is one of the things that threatened the British the most, the idea that an American president would oppose the continued colonialization of the world. Now, the British reorganized it. They set up the Commonwealth. They couldn't continue to, they basically were kicked out of India. But what did the British come up with as part of this divide and conquer strategy? A strategy called gang counter gang by Brigadier General Frank Kitson, who wrote about how the British have to create diversions to undercut support for national liberation movements. And the example he gave was in Kenya, where the Mau Mau were initially a popular national liberation movement, and the British created a phony Mau Mau that burned churches, raped nuns, conducted violence against the population to try to discredit the honest national liberation movement. Now look at today in the United States with Antifa, with the violence from the left and from the right. And it's the same thing, gang, counter gang. Mm-hmm. This is a strategy that was carried out in Europe through the 60s, 70s, and 80s, Operation Gladio with NATO. This is a strategy now that's being deployed in the United States to increase the polarization. So, if we've learned anything from this, it's that the colonial powers are not going to give up their control. The latest example of this, by the way, I just did a report on this, Global Britain. I don't know if you're familiar with this, but this is Boris Johnson's idea. The idea is that the British can no longer assert the idea of an empire, but they can use free trade to reestablish British terms of trade globally. And how's he going to do this? Well, he's going to transfer, along with Biden, the G7, which is meeting soon in England, change that to the D10, the Democratic 10, which would bring in India, Australia, and South Korea as new members, not Russia. And do you know where the D10 committee actually resides? Inside the Atlantic Council. A man named Ash Jain, who was an Obama administration person. He was the head of the Obama alumni for Biden. He heads the D10 committee in the Atlantic Council, which Boris Johnson is trying to make the new replacement for the G7. Then Johnson said the COP26 conference coming up, I think in September in Glasgow, Scotland, He wants to make that the point at which all the world accepts the idea of the zero carbon mandate. So now we see Johnson as the new empire, the global Britain, trying to continue British control over these international institutions that will be the determining factor of how nations invest, what projects they engage in, and so on. So this is a continuation of the empire from the 17th, 18th, 19th centuries in modern guise.
That's what I've been saying. I just sometimes I'm lost for words to say what is the enemy. Well, the enemy is the empire. It's the empire. It's been there. It's still there. It's not gone away, and its tentacles are reaching constantly inside of every opportunity they can see. When something good gets started, they reach inside. They subvert it to their own uses. The quote from early on after the January 6th it rings in my mind, where one of the guys, the agents provocateur, the ones with the outfits and the military chest, protectors and the helmets and all. One of those guys is going in, and he's going by a police officer that's standing there, and he says to the police officer, "Oh, no, we're not Antifa today."
Well, you know what that's like.
Well, you can change your hat. You can have an Antifa outfit. You can have a Proud Boys outfit, and it doesn't matter, because the FBI is going to pay you the same money no matter which way you go.
Or it may be that the FBI is actually the ones who are doing it.
Yeah, or hiring these guys and organizing them. That's what George Webb's reporting has been really good at revealing.
Well, in 1928, 1929, as the Hitler movement was growing, at the same time, the Communist Party of Germany was growing. And there are reports up through the mid 31, 32, up to the point when Hitler took power in January 33, that very often there would be demonstrations where the communists would attack the Nazis, or the Nazis would attack the communists, and they'd be the same people. They just switched their outfits in between riots. And this is an example of how you create an emergency situation so you can have an emergency decree. And this is what Hitler took advantage of with the Reichstag fire, where all of a sudden they turned on first the communists, then they turned on the SA, part of Hitler's own movement.
Mm-hmm.
So, because the SA was part of this intermixed grouping. But who was funding all of this? It was coming from Fritz Thyssen. Who was giving Thyssen the money, the German industrialist? It was coming from the Union Bank Corporation of New York, whose two American board members were Roland Harriman and Prescott Bush. And they continued doing that through the 30s up until 1942, when the US Justice Department seized the bank under the Trading with the Enemy Act, which means that after we had already been at war with Nazi Germany, this bank was still doing business as one of the cartels, one of the trusts that were doing business with Nazi corporations. So this is where you see this global elite that has a consistent view of opposing governments that will operate for the interests of their people as opposed to the interests of the cartels.
And one of the great quotes I got from you is Palmerston saying, speaking of British foreign policy, says, we have no friends, only interests.
No permanent friends, only permanent interests. Yep.
Okay, thank you for permanent interests. And those permanent interests are what causes them to send their tentacles into everybody else's business and to subvert it to their own use, because they don't, I was talking with Garland last night, and I said, look, what it is, there's a kind of a glass ceiling type of thing that if you can, they'll invite you to go above the glass ceiling if they think you are worthy. But two things that you got to know about it. First of all, that they use Machiavellian tactics. It's like the whole world's turned upside down once you get into their club. They will stab you in the back. They will, and you're talking about James Baker, classic, Bush guy,
Yeah.
just completely lying to the Germans, saying, NATO's not going to go into Eastern Europe. And of course, NATO has now crept right up to the borders of the Soviet, of Russia now. That kind of geopolitical lie. It's just like, von Ribbentrop and Molotov, we're going to make a deal. We're going to be friends forever. But that only lasts as long as the interest, the permanent interest lasts.
And John, the one thing that Lyndon LaRouche always said is that the British have at least two sets of policy options. For example, with Brexit, on the one hand, you had a section of the elite that was in favor of Brexit and another section that wanted to stay in Europe. What was the real issue? How could Britain continue to exert control over continental Europe? So they had another strategy, which is if they vote Brexit and decide to leave Europe, how can they continue to keep control over the finances? And they cut a deal with the European Union, which allowed the British banking interests to continue to control the settling houses of derivatives contracts for the European Union countries. This is a huge business. This is trillions of dollars. And so even as on the surface, everything we're breaking, we're leaving, we're not going to be part of Europe, the derivative transaction clearinghouses are the British banks. So, they had both sides. Same thing with China. On the one hand, they were telling Pompeo, and now they're telling Biden, we'll send British warships into the South China Sea. We're with you on that. At the same time, they're saying the Chinese, we want to be the clearinghouse for the yuan convertibility in Europe. So the classic case, we feel strongly about both sides of the issue.
Yeah. And going to continue to play both ends against the middle as long as we can get away with it.
Yeah.
That's the story. Harley, wow, my brain is tired now. I've been all over the world with you and in the history and into the future. And thank you so much for being with us. And folks, I really can't recommend enough that you get a copy of The Great Leap Backward by the Larouche Organization, available at larouche.com, laroucheorganization.com. And send your questions to Harley. Harley, you want to give your email account out so that folks can get in touch with you directly?
harleysch@gmail.com. And I'll send you a link to my blog page where I'm writing an article every week. I'm doing a daily update every day, and I'm trying to stay a little bit ahead of the world so that we can hopefully give people some options other than despair and demoralization.
Yeah, well, I'm all for that, and I think there's still a great deal of energy behind the idea of restoring our sovereignty, restoring our sense of individual rights and humanity generally. This pendulum's got to swing back. All right, thanks everyone. We will leave you with the Ospreys as usual. We'll see you tonight. Thanks, Harley.